There was much composure in the manner of the latter when the subject was broached, and he endeavored to give such a coloring to his matrimonial difficulties as would, had he succeeded, have placed the inquirer on the wrong scent. But his very manner was sufficient to give the lie to the part that he was attempting to perform in so unskillful a way, and the old man probed him so deeply as to almost penetrate to the details of the whole business. Had he done so, how much better would it have been for the poor Morgan, and still how much better would it have been for his murderers? The result of the father-in-law's inquiries amounted to this, that someone was illegally confined in the fort, but who he was, or for what purpose was he imprisoned, he could not ascertain. He then told the keeper that he would give him 24 hours in which to release the man, and if within that time he should not be released, be had to legal means to restore him to the enjoyment of freedom. It was his duty to have insisted upon his immediate liberation, and that duty would have probably been performed had not the keeper been so nearly connected with him, his wish being to prevent his relative from suffering the consequences of his conduct, provided he should at last act in accordance with the dictates of justice. I should have mentioned that the father-in-law was not a Mason, and therefore the keeper could not confide to him either the name of his prisoner or the cause of his incarceration. As soon as his father-in-law had left, the keeper proceeded to notify us of the nature of the interview he had with his relative. He plainly told us that something must be done immediately, and that if Morgan was not disposed of before the next morning, not only should we all be arrested and severely punished, but that there would be a great excitement raised against the order, and that it would fall before the torrent of popular indignation, suffering more severely than it could have done had Morgan's book been published and allowed to pass without question. It needed not that he should tell us this, for it was self-evident to every man in the dark and agitated company. A long and serious consultation took place. Many plans were proposed, discussed, and rejected in their turn, having for their object the removal of our prisoner to some more secure place of confinement, for it was difficult to settle upon a place less likely to be disturbed than that which had been originally selected. The fort had been selected at the start because it was supposed that it combined in a superior degree the leading essentials of a secret prison, yet this deeply contrived plan had baffled by so simple and commonplace a thing as the curiosity of a woman. What security could we have that any other prison would prove a better retainer of its secrets? Such security was not to be had, and we saw before us the prospect of continued danger, a constant dread of detection and punishment, to say nothing of danger of our order, so long as Morgan should live. Our liberty, our property, our characters, and the great institution on whose behalf we had originally undertaken to act would all, for very many years, it was probable, be at the mercy of every woman or child who should chance to be in the vicinity of our victim's prison. It was while we were in this state of doubt and uncertainty, regretting the past and trembling for the future, that one of our number rose to speak. He was a thoughtful, silent man generally, but always ready to act when anything was to be done, and had the reputation among us of being more deeply concerned in the business of kidnapping Morgan than any other one of the conspirators. "Brethren," he said in a firm voice, "there is no denying that our situation is a most critical one, but it is the characteristic of determined, resolute men that they always rise superior to those difficulties which are fatal to the weak and vacillating. If we are firm and do not allow ourselves to be deterred from pursuing the only course that can lead to safety, all will yet be well with us. What have we to fear? It is that Morgan may recover his liberty and bring down upon our heads the whole weight of the law, and put our order under the ban of public opinion, against which no institution, however strong, can maintain itself. How are these difficulties to be avoided? To me it seems clear that they can be avoided only by consigning Morgan to the confinement that which alone there is no possibility of escape, that of the grave. This may appear to some of you a dread alternative, but I have been prepared for it from the beginning, as the probable result of this man's seizure and imprisonment. Nor will there be anything so decidedly unjust in our thus disposing of him. Has he not placed himself in the position of a traitor? And have not the laws of God and man in all ages condemned traitors to suffer in full the last penalty? And what is the treachery which directs itself only against a country or a king in comparison with that which aims at the overthrow of a vast institution, which is gathering into its folds men of every country and binding all mankind into a common brotherhood? I say that Morgan has incurred the penalty of death, and that to visit that penalty upon him will be an act of justice and according to the principles that prevail among men in all forms of society. Our own safety, too, points to the same course, and for one, I am ready to bear a full part in placing him in the only prison that can make us all safe, while at the same time it will be a just punishment of his treachery. The words of this man in times of doubt and trial are always effectual. They were so in the present case, and the greater part of the company were carried away by the speech of that American. They assented at once to the force of his arguments, and avowed their readiness to aid him in any measure that he should deem proper under the circumstances. Some few were silent, and neither approved nor condemned the sentiments that had been put forth, and from this position they were as deeply involved and as guilty as those who were most forward in their desire for the shedding of blood. Before we separated, the death of Morgan was fully resolved upon, and it was agreed to meet on the evening of that day and fix upon the mode of execution. In the evening we all met. Several plans for putting our prisoner to death were proposed, but that which was finally adopted came from the same man who had been so successful in convincing us that we should proceed to extremities. We were 8 in number, and it was determined that 3 of us should be selected by lot to perform the part of executioners. 8 pieces of paper were procured, 5 of which were to remain blank, while the letter D was written on the others. These pieces of paper were placed in a large box, from which each man was to draw one at the same moment. After drawing, we were all to separate without looking at the paper that each held in his hand. As soon as we arrived at certain distances from the place of the rendezvous, the tickets were to be examined, and those who held blanks were to return instantly to their homes, and those 3 who should hold the marked tickets were to proceed to the fort at midnight and there put Morgan to death, in such a manner as should be to themselves most fitting. The tickets were placed in the box and drawn forth simultaneously, and we all left the place in different directions without looking at our papers. The proceeding was so rapid that I had no time for reflection until I found myself in the open air and walking fast to a point at which I thought it would be safe for me to examine my ticket. And even then I did not think so much of the atrocious nature of the crime in which I was engaged as of the chances that there were of my having drawn a blank, which would indeed have been a prize to me. After walking for a mile or thereabouts and seeing no one was near, I halted and examined my ticket, which I had kept within my clenched hand. I started back with horror, as by the dim light I was enabled to trace the fatal letter distinctively drawn on the white ground. My first thought was to turn and fly, but where should I fly to? Would not my comrades suspect the cause of my absence, and would they not, from regard to their own safety, deem it necessary to treat me as they were about to treat Morgan? Beside, was I not bound in honor? Aye, and by my oath too, to go onward in the enterprise, horrible and unlawful as it was, and fearful as might be the consequence. I had offered no remonstrances against the plan for the making away with Morgan, but had gone on step by step with the other conspirators. And was I not therefore bound in honor to continue in the same fearful path until the end? Strange as it may appear, and so singularly is the mind of man constituted, the sensation that I most deeply experienced at that awful moment was one of shame, that I should have thought of evading the dread task that I had been selected by fortune to perform. All idea of its criminality was absorbed in this, and I resolved to go through with the enterprise and with a bold heart and a steady hand. As for the hour for the meeting of the three approached, I proceeded toward the fort, not without a lingering hope that the two who were to be associated with me as executioners would be less punctual than myself, and that they would fail altogether of keeping their rendezvous. But this hope soon left me, for as I arrived near the fort, I was joined by two of those from whom I had so recently separated, and then it was that we ascertained who had drawn the death tickets. Both these men were Americans, and neither of them, I am certain, had a less desire to take part in the affair than myself. However, there was now no show of reluctance, all of us acting as if we had made up our minds to perform this terrible task from which there were no retreat. Immediate arrangements were made to carry out the sentence, if such it could be called, that had been passed upon the prisoner. My comrades left to procure a boat, one of them knowing where it was easy to find it, having been agreed upon that Morgan should be sunk in the Niagara, in hope that he and our crime alike would be thus buried beneath the waves. My part was to proceed to the magazine and announce to Morgan his fate and prepare him, so far as I could, to meet it. When my partners in crime had left, I passed to the magazine. On entering, I found Morgan asleep, and for a few moments I stood and regarded him by the light of the lantern that I had brought with me. He was pale and haggard and looked like an old man, though in reality he was not much past the prime of existence. Nevertheless, he slept quietly, and my entrance did not appear to have disturbed him. I gently awoke him, and he stared wildly up and gazed at me. I was a stranger to him, and he hurriedly demanded my business. "William Morgan," I replied, "I come to you on a sad duty. It is to prepare you for your last hour on earth. The great crime of which you have been guilty has been duly considered by those against whom it has been committed, and they, possessed both of the right and the power to act, have resolved that you must die. It is now past midnight, and before the earliest dawn shall you have prepared. You must be no longer on earth. I leave you to prepare for the great change you are to undergo." Thus saying, I placed the lantern on the floor and was in the act of leaving the magazine for the purpose of stationing myself at the entrance, when Morgan loudly called me back and poured out a number of questions. He demanded by what authority we had condemned him, who had been his judges, were they Americans or foreigners, how was he to die, and many other questions of the like character. I told him that I had not come to answer questions, but to notify him of his sentence, from which there was no appeal or possibility of escape. I added that I had heard he had been a soldier, that I had been one myself, and that I hoped he would meet his end as became a man who had borne arms. He took no notice of this, but commenced wringing his hands and talking of his wife and children, the recollection of whom in that awful hour terribly affected him. His wife, he said, was young and inexperienced, and his children were but infants. What would become of them were he, the husband and father, cut off, and they even ignorant of his fate? I endeavored to console him on this point by assuring him that the fraternity of which he had been an unworthy member and which he had sought to ruin had already provided for his family, and that they would not be permitted to want anything.